we've talked about what I think is a plot hole in this episode a few times, and that's evolved. Whether it's a plot hole, whether it was the TVA lying. Where do you stand on that now?
What plot hole was that with Sylvie?
It's about Sylvie. Like,
Yeah.
how is there? Well, and now more versions of Loki.
Mhm.
If we have a sacred timeline, how are there versions of Loki that physically look different from Tom Hiddleston? Because if there's a sacred timeline, Loki can only be born once in that timeline, so it has to look like Tom Hiddleston. Therefore, any variant would also look like Tom Hiddleston.
Well, I think that we need to think about it. It's like you ever heard this idea? Like you ever played? That's a card game. And this is gonna make sense to me. It's a card game called Dutch Blitz. Have you ever played it?
I've never even heard of it.
Have you ever played Uno?
I've played Uno.
Okay. Have you ever played any kind of high speed card game?
I've played Uno.
Okay. Well, Dutch Blitz is a game where you play with four people or more, and you
Yeah.
have it's sort of like solitaire. So you have a bunch of cards in front of you that you have to match, but you also have to match cards in the middle of the pile. So you're competing with everybody else in the game to match as many cards as possible. Dutch Blitz is a great game to play it. But
Okay.
a friend of mine who's really good at it, she's awesome at it. She says that you have to have soft eyes, which means you
A
can't
soft focus.
soft focus. Very good.
Race car drivers do the same thing. You
Yeah,
don't look at the cards in front of you. You have to have a soft focus so you can see everything.
yeah, and that idea of soft focus. I mean, I do that when you play video games. To be honest with
You
you,
should do that. Everybody should do that when they're driving, by the way.
soft focus. Okay, that's good advice. It sounds scary, but that's a good piece of advice. I do
Yeah.
this when I play video games. If you play like Destiny 2 or any kind of high speed PvP game with a lot of stuff going on, when you first pick up the sticks, you're just nervous because you have to shoot this thing in front of you and you don't know what to do. But after a
Mhm.
while, you get such a good soft focus that you're not even looking at your gun anymore. You're not looking at any particular individual. You're looking at the whole battle space and you're thinking like 10
Right.
steps ahead. I
Mhm.
think when it comes to the idea of the variants and Loki and the sacred timeline, you should also have a soft focus on that. Like this, like you can't focus too much on this Loki is an alligator, right? Think more of did this Loki could this Loki have achieved what he needed to achieve in the timeline, right? And like the idea is the reason why the alligator Loki and the black Loki and the classic Loki, what the reason why those people got pruned is because their timelines began to diverge.
All
But
of all of the Lokis on is that even a planet? All of the Lokis in the void can be explained, I guess. Or I think the one that cannot is Sylvie.
yeah, she could, but she can be explained. Like if a woman Loki could do the same thing as an alligator Loki, right? I mean, the whole purpose of Loki's is to fight Thor and to make Thor lift up and become a hero, right? That's the whole purpose.
Right.
But at some point, Sylvie became more than she was supposed to be, right? And then they had to prune her. So the way I look at the sacred timeline,
How many times have you been born?
I think that's a metaphysical question, Mike. To be honest with you,
Yeah.
that's
I've been born once.
okay. But in theory, okay. So which one do you think is the true Loki? It could be the Loki that we understand, but it could be Sylvie. Like
Well, so
who's to say who's true?
I'm back to I think that the showrunners and the writers created a plot hole.
I think.
Um,
Well, here's what I think, and this is me helping the show out a little bit. Okay, I'm
okay.
just helping the show out. I so Nathaniel Richards' character said something very interesting. He said that he discovered that there are universes on top of his. Right.
Right.
Okay.
Yes.
So okay. Now, do you have any kind of paper in front of you?
No, but I can visualize.
Okay. Can you really?
Yeah, and
All
our
right.
listeners can visualize
Okay.
too.
Okay. Listeners and Mike, please visualize. I'm holding a notebook right now. Can you hear it? Okay. Now,
Yep.
I'm flat. The notebook is flat. There are pages in the middle, on top, and on the bottom. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, each one of these pages are going the same direction and doing the same thing, and they look the same. But they're all individual pages doing the exact same thing.
Right.
But let's say if I flip through the pages, let's say
Mhm.
if one page, the ink's messed up, right? I can't write on it because the pages isn't right. I'm going to tear this page out. That's a variant, right? And so the
Mhm.
idea with the sacred timeline, if you looked at the graphic that Disney showed that was surrounding the seal at the end of time, the sacred timeline had these threads in it. So the sacred timeline was a big white like thread, but it had multiple threads in it. So
Yeah.
think about it this way, Mike. Think about how like you can have an alligator Loki, you can have a woman Loki, you can have a black Loki, and you have a regular Loki, right? They each going to do the same thing, but if one of them decides to do something different, they are going to cause a variation of the timeline, and they're going to create a multiverse, right? So yes, Sylvie is different than the other Lokis,
I
but
think
her
we could do a whole like bonus episode of the podcast on just arguing our points on this.
100%. Well, there's nothing really else to talk about with this episode. The
All right,
episode's
so
done.
here's how you can explain all the Lokis within the void.
Okay.
Okay?
I think I just did.
No.
Okay. All right.
Here's how you can explain all the Lokis within the void. Okay? And this goes back to what He Who Remains was talking about. So he says again, so before this episode, I was like, okay, yeah, there's no plot hole. There never was a multiversal war. That was all a lie by the TVA. However, He Who Remains says that he in fact did
Yeah.
in the multiversal war and had a sacred timeline. So that's
Yeah.
where I say, okay, now there's a plot hole again. However, the way there can be all those different Lokis within the void is because they could have been sent to the void by or as a result of ending the multiversal war. And we all know, what do Lokis do? Lokis survive.
If that makes you feel better, that's a great
So,
a great explanation.
so that's
Yeah.
how they could be there.
Sure.
However, Sylvie is still
Sylvie was
a
supposed to be
problem.
there. Sylvie was supposed to be there. She escaped. So if
Right.
she would have been pruned when she was a girl, she would still be there. She would.
But she would still have to come from the sacred timeline, which means she'd have to look like Tom Hiddleston.
But all the other ones did too, though.
We don't know that.
Okay. All right.
They could have been from before the multiversal war. We don't know that. All right. Anyway,
Anyway.
that was all. Like we could probably do an hour and a half or 2 hours just talking about that, I think.
Well, I can hold in my head the idea of two things being the same but different, right? And like, I don't think the universe cares your sexual orientation or gender.
No,
If
I
you're
don't either.
supposed to, if you're supposed to do the same thing, if
within a
Sylvie
single timeline, somebody can only be born once.
well, but my paper metaphor, right? My paper metaphor.
That's multiversal.
I know, but okay, no. Think about it this way: you have a bunch of different timelines that are doing the same thing. So in that reality, all
That's
these
a bunch of different timelines. Yeah, I agree with that. If we
But
have
they're not-
multiverses,
but
then no problem.
yeah, but think about it this way: they all are a bunch of multiverses, right? But if
Right.
one goes weird, it creates an alternate multiverse and it splits from the thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but if it's coming off of that, then
Okay,
yeah.
no,
Anyway, all right.
I
So
feel you. No, I
that's,
feel you. No, I feel you. I don't know if it's a plot hole. It's just like I think it's a overall disagreement of the fundamentals of how multi-universes could work. Like you could,
Yeah.
there could be a female version of you. Which one's the and the whole idea.
absolutely in a multiverse there could
Yeah.
be. Yes,
And the whole
no-
idea of a
no
sacred
question.
timeline's a lie. Like this is the
But within
timeline.
my
that
timeline, you have to be
your
a
timeline.
white guy.
Yeah, and
You have to be a
your
white guy.
timeline. Yeah, and yours. Right.
Right.
So okay,
So
the
you're
idea
saying that Sylvie came from a different timeline than Tom did.
100%.
So she did not come from the sacred timeline, or Tom did not come from the sacred timeline.
No, what I'm saying is that the sacred timeline creates variant timelines, and they can stay under the radar until they get weird. So, for example, the alligator timeline was in the sacred timeline. The black guy was in the sacred timeline. All these different Lokis were in the same timeline, right? But because they got weird, they diverged, and then they got noticed by the TVA. And then
That
they
would
got
have to be. They'd have to like the timeline would have to diverge while they're an embryo or something for that to happen.
yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, true.
Anyway,
But the whole thing about the sacred
Yeah.
timeline's a lie. There is no sacred timeline. The universe wants to have a multiverse, and
Right.
the He Who Remains artificially manipulated the timeline to create one that he likes, right? One that
Yeah,
he
but
prefers.
So maybe he allowed two.
What I'm
And
saying
he
is
hasn't
that
said
it's not.
this yet.
Yeah,
One was Tom Hiddleston's timeline, and the other was Sophie's timeline. And he's like, "All right, I've got Sophie. Let's chop off her timeline." And now we're down to one. I really like this timeline. We're gonna stick with that.
what I'm saying is that he's at a monitor and he thinks, okay, I have my sacred timeline, it's perfect, but underneath it's not. You have a lot of different variations being created, and he doesn't notice them until they diverge too much, and he sees them. So I think
Mhm.
that the timeline is, I think it by nature in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and just by the idea of fiction, right, in general, multiverses, the idea of multiple different timelines is natural, and he's
Mhm.
artificially controlling it. It's not supposed to be that way, right?
Right.
And
Right.
so he's looking at a monitor, and then he's like, "Oh wow, a variant, a variation. I gotta prune that." But there's all kinds of different variations bubbling under there that he doesn't notice until it happens. Now, this is not. It's not our fault that we're arguing about this. It's the show's fault. But the show could do a better job explaining it. But it would take, like, we've been talking about this for 17 minutes, right? It's like
Right.
it would take
Yeah.
half an episode.
They could explain it pretty quickly, I think.